Today we're going to be talking about the latest Hellboy. Here's Hellboy the Crooked Man. And of course, I'm not the biggest Hellboy fan. I haven't read any of the comics. None. And it should go to show that I haven't read any of the Marvel comics, the DC comics. Pretty much the only comics that I have ever read were probably Masters of the Universe / He-Man comics. Mainly because they usually put in one of those little comic books in with every He-Man action figure back in the day. And all of my brother's action figures still had their comics, so I read those. Those are the only ones, the only comics that I have ever read. Naturally, I have looked up comic stores, There's a thing called the internet, and there's a thing called Google. It's a really fancy and amazing thing. Whenever you have a question, you should ask Google it. So that's what I did. I asked Google a lot of questions about comics and comic book stories, and I read the Wikipedia articles about comic books and all these other fancy little doohickeys that I'd rather not go out and procure because, instead of comic books, I got into manga, and I picked up Dragon Ball, the entire complete series, and I never picked up anything else manga-wise outside of maybe Yu Yu Hakusho, Yu-Gi-Oh, Kenshin. Okay, so I picked up a bunch of other things, but not comics, not comics. But I've always been a Hellboy fan. I have the 2 Guillermo del Toro movies. I've even got the remake / reboot Hellboy movie that I absolutely remember absolutely nothing about. So that just goes to show how forgettable the reboot Hellboy was, but that also goes to show that if it was terrible, I'd probably remember that too. So it wasn't terrible, the reboot. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't memorable either. It was just a forgettable reboot. But the Guillermo del Toro movies, both of them, are very well made, they're very well crafted, they're very well designed. Guillermo del Toro is an absolute artist. He is like a Renaissance painter when it comes to movie set designs and color. It is incredible to watch his films just for the sets that he puts people in. He puts them in costumes, outfits, the makeup, everything that's behind the characters is so artistically crafted. It is amazing to see Hellboy brought to life through Guillermo del Toro. And the reboot didn't do that justice. It was a very forgettable movie. A very forgettable one. But Crooked Man, Crooked Man it's certainly way better than the reboot movie. Oh, yes. But I don't like it more than Guillermo del Toro's movies. I don't. But I will say this. I like this story. This Hellboy. This setting. This premise. The filming techniques. The genre blend of bringing actual horror into this movie. This film feels like a horror movie with Hellboy in it, making wisecracks and beating people up, but it is shot like a horror movie. The music is horror. It is very well horrifyingly made off of an indie fan film budget. And of course, the Guillermo del Toro movies were not made in a horror film aspect, but they did lovingly bring all of the costumes to life. Of course, we all love our boy, whose name I'm currently forgetting, Ron Perlman. Yeah, it takes me a minute, but I remember names. If it just takes me a minute. Ron Perlman. We all love him as Hellboy. He's the greatest, awesome, amazingest. I think this guy is a great Hellboy. I do. This one right here. He's not Ron Perlman, but he's giving that Ron Perlman impersonator energy. He's the actor you get when you can't afford Ron Perlman. So you get this guy. And I think he really has a future in the Hellboy films if this actually was given more than $2 to make, I think it could have been a very well-crafted movie. But for the $2 that it was given to buy the camera and the 2 cents to pay for everything else, it was really well done for what they had. $2 for this whole movie. They really did a good job. I loved the idea of this crooked man. You know, the little head crooked and all that stuff. I love that idea. This backwoods setting. It's very cheap, but they really made the most out of it. And I love when an indie film, when indie groups, indie budgets actually try. They do their absolute best with the $2 that they have to create something that feels like it was made for $10. This film feels like it was made for $50. Maybe not 50 million, but it's certainly better than $2. So it really looks better than the budget that they had. Now, there's a lot of noticeable CG, especially at the beginning, but you know, I don't care. I don't care. I saw a man's head explode within the first 5 minutes, and I thought, you know what? That sounds like Hellboy. Come, I'm in. And it was very fun. It was a very fun time. The atmosphere was very chilling and horror, even though everything was very limited to the backwoods and witches. I like the witches. I like the aura of the witches, the creepy stuff. I like the idea of bringing a church and all the witches can't cross onto sanctified ground. They built this church on top of a mine shaft, which has a portal to the demon realm and all that shit stuff. So they really did Hellboy justice for the $2 that they had. And I would honestly argue that if they had maybe half the budget Guillermo del Toro had, and a Guillermo del Toro set design, on top of making it a horror movie, I think it might top Guillermo del Toro's movies. I honestly do think it would top Guillermo del Toro's movie. I like the folklore aspect of Guillermo del Toro's movies. All of his movies feel like he's telling a fairy tale. Pan's Labyrinth, Crimson Peak, Shape of Blue Water. He tells fairy tales. These are fairy tale mystical things, and he brought that fairy tale aspect into Hellboy. And while I do definitely appreciate that, and I do love Ron Perlman as Hellboy, I love the horror aspect of The Crooked Man more. Even though this isn't as good of a movie as the Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy movies, I think it is a better premise, a better setting, a better horror. It's a better Hellboy-ishness about it, if that makes sense. If you haven't seen it because you have no faith in it, take it from me. It's definitely worth watching, and it's far better than the reboot, because the reboot's completely forgettable. I actually remember what happened to this movie. I even remember who's in it. You know, not the names of people who's in it. You know, I'm terrible with the names, obviously, but I remember the faces and the people, their acting, their line delivery, and all that. I remember that. I remember the scenes. It's a very memorable thing. You may not remember how cheap it looks after a couple years after watching this, but you may end up looking back on this movie and going, you know, they did really good here. It could have been a way better if it had a little bit more money put into it, and had a little bit more talent put into the backdrops, into the sets, the building the sets and all that stuff, and the makeup, and maybe a little bit better polish on the CG. It could have looked incredible. But for what it was, for $2, they made it look like $50.